Okay, let's get started with our next session. We're going to have about an hour and 15 minutes to have presentations and discussion on the role of how to design sustainable cities. I'm Andrew Altman, now the Chief Executive of the 2012 Olympic Legacy Company in London, and joining me is our co-chair.
My name is Ömer Kanıpak. I'm the founder and director of Architectural Center, Istanbul.
Great.
And I think we can start directly by inviting Mr. Rogers to the microphone.
What we're going to do is, Richard Rogers is getting set, just so you know, and I think the way this has been set up is to make the connection between the architecture for sustainable cities, how we plan and lay out what is the form of sustainable cities, connect that to the architecture, the building of cities, which is what Alejandro Zarapolo is going to speak to, and then the politics. So really connecting politics, planning, architecture, how do these connect or not connect in the design of the sustainable city, and then we'll have some discussion about how that relates to Istanbul and the role of architects in the shaping of Istanbul, which we'll have more discussion later, but we'll begin that today. So with that, we'll turn to Richard Rogers.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm delighted to be in Constantinople. Actually, I also want to say how beautiful this space is, especially with the sun coming through. It's a wonderful marriage between old and new. I'm going to speak about the compact city, the only sustainable form that we have, the live, work, leisure, compact city. A photograph which I've used for years, constellation of compact cities. I believe that the city is now the hub for decision-making. Of course, there's a global concept of politics, and there's a national. But the city is where it's at. More and more people go there. And I also think the city is the place you can associate with. Not least because in cities you can play football and you can't make wars. And I think that gives a big advantage to cities. I'm sorry for not having Istanbul in the middle as I should. It's not even a very clear hinge. But it is a hinge. And it is a potentially fabulous city in an amazing position of control. I'll talk for a moment about what I would term a compact city. The city that is clearly delineated. London has been fortunate of having a green belt, but that probably is a good image as anything. Whether it's a green belt or it's a sea or whatever form, the city should not continue to sprawl. It is not sustainable. The more sprawl, the more separation of activities, the more ghettoization. This is Pienza, probably the first Renaissance planned city. And this is a photograph now, and it shows, even in Italy, you can actually stop growth. You can actually curtail it. And that's what gives it the character, gives it the view to it, the view from it, and also it gives you a sense of place. Sprawl and dereliction, two cities. One is just behind Nice, typical of the south of France. Nice looks as though it's got some terrible sort of poxy illness over everywhere, all behind it. It's sort of white little buildings, no communication, no contact, total isolation, and the only way you can move through it is by car. There is nowhere to find the countryside, and as far as creating communities, socially inclusive communities, again, it's impossible. In the end, it seems to me you go from work or shopping center, I guess, to bed and back, but there's no mix. Obviously, again, it is very much about, in this situation, middle class, wealthy, and as you get into the ghettos, it's the poor. Total separation, building problems for the future. On the right is a piece of Manchester, somewhat out of date, but I put it here because at the time that we, the Urban Task Force, I did it with Ricky Burdett, investigated this east part of Manchester, 4 out of 5 houses were derelict. Anybody who had a few bits of money had moved out, leaving the poor and the sick behind. And of course, again, a feeling of fear. The whole concept of eyes on the street didn't exist because there was nobody there. So, of course, it became a very dangerous area. Emptiness is dangerous. Oh, don't know. It's okay. What did I do? So to the compact city. The principles. The compact city is compact and polycentric. It's well connected, encourages walking and public transport. You heard how little it costs to develop the most important part of the connected city, which is basically walking, cycling, and public transport. It obviously is ideal in terms of cutting down CO2. A diverse range of uses. The overlapping of activities. I always say that when you overlap activities, exciting things can start happening. Nothing happens in a ghetto. Nothing happens in an exclusive one-activity space. When you start to bring in the edges, when it starts to actually you interact, then you do begin to get an exchange. Inclusive, both poor and the rich. Again, separation. You see it strongly here. You see it in most cities. You see it in the East End of London. You see in the East End of London the 4 poorest boroughs, 3 of the poorest boroughs in Western Europe. You see it in Paris, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, all around the periphery. Environmental responsibility, we've heard a lot of it. I'm not going to expand on it. It is critical. It is the thing that may finish us all off in the next few years. So in a way, that is the most important thing. But of course, it's connected to all the things I've been saying. Quality of design, both in the sense of place and the continuity of the sense of place in 3 dimensions. I'm going to talk about the fact that there isn't really a cutoff between planning and architecture. I'm going to talk about 1 or 2 buildings to try and point out that it's all one. We're talking about a morphology, and it's a serious mistake to divide things in flat and vertical. And of course, secure and just. There's been lots of talking about it. There is no question that a massive difference between the poor and the rich everywhere, including whether it's New York or whether it's the Far East, the same stresses are being, social stresses, you can see in societies which have large gaps. Distribution of wealth has to be one of the key elements. I'm going the wrong way. Okay. The anatomy of a city. On the right is actually Manchester, that piece of Manchester you saw, so this is more specifically applied. The left is an idealistic diagram, which shows that starting with small communities, we suggested in the English economy, in the English landscape, that about 5,000 people makes a community. 5,000 people allows you one bus stop in economic terms. So it's a good start. It allows you a small shop, a small health place, a small nursery. So you begin to get a community. That's a 5,000, and each one of those small circles, the smaller circles, is about 5,000. And if the 5,000 are going to be within 5 minutes walk, then it gets you a specific density. 60, 70 dwellings per hectare. Obviously, the more dwellings per hectare, the more successful the bus system is, the more successful the corner shop is, the more mix there is. Put a bunch of these, it's just very much like a piece of anatomy of a body. Put a bunch of these, in this situation we sort of put 5 together around a bigger one, and that becomes a district. And you link them all up by public transport, whether it's bus, and of course buses are flexible, fantastic, tremendously good return for money, or an underground system which works specifically in old cities where you can't get buses through, or trains. And this is sort of the far corner, the left on your left far corner is, let's say, the center of the city building out. So the concept is a hierarchy of units of living. There's a scale down at the bottom of the drawing, at the center of which there is a higher density, so built around the transportation hubs. And that gives also a visual structure, which is actually quite interesting. In other words, you get cities which begin to vary, reflecting the density. I mentioned that I was going to talk a little bit about buildings, as I'm an architect. And Pompidou Center, with Renzo Piano, encapsulates most of the things that I have been talking and will talk about. Public space, for instance. We gave over half the space for the competition, and we were, interestingly enough, we were only one of the 700. We gave over half the space to a piazza. And we continued the piazza all the way up the facade of the building, and the escalators, and so on. Now, it was a fun palace. It's a cultural center, easier to do. But the point I'm making is, buildings don't stop when they hit the ground. There is an entrance door. There is a space that starts to move through buildings. Public buildings especially have this. Lloyd's of London. If the last one was really a fun palace, then Lloyd's is a traditional British club, where it's more private, no colours allowed. Only colour we were allowed was grey. Any shade of grey we could have. But you can do it, because after all, it's about the play of light and shadow. That's what architecture is about. But apart from that, it has a strong skyline, which is part of the public domain as well. What you see across the sky is a public domain element. The excitement of going to see the roofs of Rome is part of that excitement. So one mustn't forget the three-dimensional aspects, which is the architectural aspect, which is why I don't really believe in the profession of planning on its own, though I think architecture has much to learn from planning. Just going back for a moment on the Lloyd's, which was the first office building we built. At that period, that's about 1980, there was a big discussion in England, especially with Lloyd's, of whether the next business capital together with New York would be Frankfurt. And Lloyd's discussed going to Frankfurt. It's interesting to think back that not so long ago, we were so unconfident, there was such a lack of confidence within Britain that we thought we would all move to Frankfurt. Thanks God we didn't. But not that I've got anything against Frankfurt. But it does give you that sense of change. And there's a much greater security, I think, within the consciousness of the British at the moment. Bordeaux. This is more about transparency. When I say transparent, these are courts. Courts are usually built like prisons, but you haven't been sent to prison yet when you go there to be tried. So this is more like an education. Actually, a court is an educational establishment, as a hospital, as all those institutions. Public have to have a right in their relationship with public buildings. So this is transparent. The piazza, which we formed in front, goes through the building. You go up the steps, and people and children move through the building. So that's one form of transparency. It's also transparency about light and form, also creating a beautiful piazza. And it's also probably the most sustainable building that we've designed in terms of cutting down on CO2. Last one of the buildings, travel. I have vivid memories of travel, especially of trains in the post-war period, where travel was still slightly possible, and going to Paris stations and seeing trains going off to Istanbul on one end or Copenhagen on the other. It's very, very exciting. That spirit of travel, which is really about architecture, is catching the spirit as well as catching the function. We've tried to reinterpret that catching of the spirit within this airport in Paris. And after all, nowadays, mainly due to security, we spend hours in airports. So they might as well be something which is exciting. London, very briefly. These are the new London plan, and what it basically says is, yes, we are talking about growths of, if we're looking back 10 years and looking forwards 10 years, well over about 1.5 million people, going up from about just over 6 million to going up towards 8 million. Ken Livingstone, we said, agreed that all that development would be on derelict land. No growth out of that land. No shopping centres, which is blighted everywhere here, I notice. Shopping centres takes the very wealth of the city, the very people out of the centre. And of course, the shopping centres, you have to go by car. It's been a number of studies have been shown to show that there is nothing more gas-guzzling and actually more costly in energy terms than a shopping centre out in the countryside. You could say the same for a house, by the way. There's also another study that shows a house house in the countryside, even if it's a high-tech, environmentally perfect house, will use more energy than an old house in the city. So stop pulling things out of the city, like shopping, and making cities mono-cities. We've seen those all over the place. And pour things back in. We've also, that maintains the green belt. Also, bring in 50%. Ken Livingstone said, I want all dwellings to be built will be 50% affordable dwellings. So for every one you build another one on the site ideally, or on a neighboring site. Again, mix. We didn't get to 50%, we got to about 37%, but it does start to get a mix. Congestion charging, you have to discourage cars from coming in. You have to have very good reasons for not going in. And thank you, 5 minutes. And I think that's critical. Docklands, the poorest part in London, where, in fact, the Olympics are going to do, and there will be a city here built for 400,000 to 500,000 people. And this shows basically the Docklands. You've seen some of the concepts previously, the polycentres developing along the river. And on the right are two of the diagrams of what we have called City East. And the bottom one, you can just about see the Olympics being developed. The importance of the Olympics are up to point. Yes, the 17 days of running around the tracks. The real importance of the Olympics is, as Barcelona did, you can regenerate the city. Finally, on London, before touching on Paris, the river has come back. The south bank of the river was a no-go area 15 years ago. It is now the most popular place of London. It doesn't take a lot to regenerate a city. And in fact, on the left are two diagrams. The top one was 15, 20 years ago. That little bit of yellow across the river is all the public space. Now the whole of the river has become a public space. And finally, Paris. I won't go through the principles of Paris because they're very close to the principles of London. Sarkozy asked 10 teams. We were one of the teams with Arabs and LSC, and we were asked whether we would look at Paris. Very grandiose, very presidential, continuation of Louis XIV, Napoleon, and a few other well-known politicians. And so obviously Sarkozy thought, well, if Mitterrand can do Grand Projet, I'm going to do the Grandest Projet. The concept of a compact city, the use of the red arrows of derrick land. There's plenty of derrick land. In London, where we are putting the 2 million, in fact, all the cities of England, where we've been pouring in buildings, not enough. No, the actual amount of derrick land is still the same quantity as it was before we started, because derrick land continues to come online. Transportation, existing transportation, some of the best transport, probably is the best metro system, rail system in Europe, and probably the best in the world, well, perhaps Tokyo. But it all goes into the center. What we found out was that 70% of the people in Paris do not go to the center. They want to go to the suburb, round the suburbs, circumferal. And there's no circumferal. So everybody, whether you want to go, if you want to go and see a neighbor, you have to go into the center and then go out again. So we suggested there should be a circumferal system, a series of communities, the big communities, the big red lumps. The red line is the circumferal system. That now has been, not exactly as shown here, has been taken up by the government. Money has been found. So this will both link up existing places and also strengthen both the poor areas, which is the only way that you can start to move the poor areas, but also universities and think places. That's one of the strong recommendations. The strengthening of existing places like the Le de France. When you look at Le de France, it's actually very poorly used. It's nearly all offices, vast spaces in between. It's not dense enough. This is all about live, work, leisure, and the potential of building Le de France, where there is a good transportation system, and it would be easy to increase the transportation. So Le de France is absolutely ready for a further densification. Shows some of the motorways and the system. On the right, you can see the damage to the texture of a city. This is typical of any. You could be here. In other words, the rails and roads tear the cities together. You can't get across them. They need to be repaired. Our suggestion was you could start to build across them. You could start to put parks on them. You could start to put servicing systems on it to use these places so that people would not be excluded from one side to another. And that is Gare du Nord on the right-hand side. And finally, this is just an approach to 1,000 projects. In other words, rather than a big project, what we're saying is, yes, there's some primary statements to be made, like linking Paris across the big roads and railways, but really what it's about is planting the right projects in the right communities and strengthening especially the communities who are in trouble, the poor communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard.